Hello folks, today we're going to dive into the fun you can have by roasting your own coffee at home. I've been doing this for about 5 years at home and have learned quite a bit along the way. First, let's take a quick look at the history of coffee over the years. It has a rich history and place in human culture. Early references to coffee start back at least as far as the 15th century. The caffeine was used in early prayers to aid in concentration. It quickly spread and made its way into Italy and Mediterranean trade routes by the 16th century. By the 17th century, coffee houses had begun to emerge across Western Europe. By 1788, St. Dominique in the Caribbean islands supplied half the world's coffee. By 1852, Brazil had become the world's largest coffee producer. Even though it had somewhat controversial origins, it became a staple of a lot of areas a lot faster than some of its botanical counterparts, like tomatoes and potatoes. The roasting and brewing techniques were also quite diverse based on the area of the world you look at. Turkish coffee, for instance, is radically different than filter coffee brewing that is the most common here in the U.S. Turkish coffee is ground very fine and is added directly to the water, then boiled and served with a generous amount of sugar. Some of the earliest coffee brewers were based on the siphoning principle. Water was heated, which caused it to expand up into a brewing chamber where the grounds were. After a bit, the heat was removed, and the cooling of the liquid will pull it back down through a filter. I have a siphon brewer, and even though it's a fun science experiment, I'm also glad more modern techniques have evolved to take a lot of the inconsistency out of the results. One of the more modern interpretations of brewing was started in Italy. Forcing water through finely ground coffee created a much stronger brew and is a completely different result than what is considered traditional coffee. The roasting process has undergone at least as many changes as the brewing. Originally, the green beans would have been heated over a fire in either a clay or metal vessel. It's easy to do, but requires constant motion to keep the beans heating evenly and prevent scorching. The beans themselves absorb quite a bit of heat during most of the process also, and so relatively small batches yield the best results. Over a fire, the most I'd probably roast would be enough for a single pot of coffee. On an industrial scale, the drum roaster is the norm. It's a lot like putting your beans in the clothes dryer, just with a lot more heat added. Industrial roasters can do many pounds of coffee at a time. Large-scale operations can push hundreds of pounds in a batch, but most tend to fall in the 10 to 50 pound range. Natural gas or propane is the most common heat source because it's easy to regulate and simpler to apply evenly. The home roasting machines come in a pretty wide variety of options. I've seen everything from a clay pot that you put over your barbecue or stove to halogen lights or electric elements. Hot air poppers, cast iron skillets, and baking sheets are also repurposed frequently to make homemade roasters. From experience, I can tell you the more evenly you can apply the heat, the better the results. You also don't want to blast the bean with tons of heat, which will not allow the roasting process to get all the way into the center of the bean before the outside gets scorched, which, by the way, tastes pretty nasty. Ask me how I know. Home roasters usually yield anywhere from 1/4 to 1 pound in a batch. The amount of time and heat that's applied during a roast is called a profile. Dialing in a good profile is an art and depends on several factors. Different growing locations can affect the characteristics of a bean quite a bit. In general, the higher the elevation a bean is grown at, the more dense and hard it becomes. This makes the beans behave quite a bit differently when being roasted. The flavor profile of a bean is also greatly affected by the altitude of the grower. The less dense beans grow at a lower altitude tend to take the heat better and require less time overall to roast. There are two broad varieties of beans, which are called Arabica and Robusta. Arabica beans have a more delicate flavoring balance, but also produce less caffeine. Robusta is a bit more basic in the flavor department, but can have up to 50% more caffeine. Robusta is also more oily and produces more smoke when roasting. Arabica is mostly considered a higher quality bean in general. Almost all commercial coffees are a blend of several different origins and both varieties of bean. Usually this is done as a cost savings measure, as well as offering a wider palette of flavor choices. Specialty coffees almost exclusively use Arabica beans. I've roasted both, and they're both manageable, but I would never recommend trying to roast a blend of any kind in a single batch, as it will throw your results into the land of complete random luck. As far as I know, all commercial roasting is done with single bean types, then blended later in the packaging process. When you're first learning to roast, sticking to a single bean type will remove several variables that will make dialing in your technique more difficult. As you get more experienced, you'll be able to make more educated guesses based on the bean types. Finding green beans is relatively easy. I tend to get mine on Amazon. You'll find everything from quarter-pound packs up to 10 to 20 pounds. I tend to get 10 pounds at a time, mostly because after that amount, I'm ready to try something different. I'd avoid a variety pack at first, simply because, again, it will add difficulty in refining your profile, as each type will behave differently. Coffee beans are also graded based on the quality of the beans themselves, as in how many of the beans are broken and how consistent the bean sizes are. Well, you don't necessarily need to get the highest grade only. The higher the grading, the easier it will be in general to work with. Broken beans and irregular sizing makes each batch less even. Popcorn air popper is what a lot of folks will use to get started in their roasting journey. This is a good choice from a cost standpoint. The thing I've found is that they tend to roast fairly quickly, which reduces your margin for error. You really want to watch your batch closely and get tuned into the stages of roasting so you can get a good feel for what's happening. When I'm roasting, I use my sense of smell as much as any other sense. The roaster I use, which is a Bmore 2000, has automated roasting profiles built in, but I still manually intervene to compensate for variations in the different bean types I'm using. There is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all recipe. Even differences in the drying process at the same farms can change the times and behavior a little bit from batch to batch. When you're learning, it's okay to be wrong. While some batches may take on weird characteristics or the odd taste, you won't make yourself sick or completely ruin a batch unless you scorch it to death or start it on fire. Yes, I've started batches on fire. Keep an eye on it during the entire process. The first stage of roasting is called the drying process. I've usually heard it described as having a grassy smell, and the beans slowly transition from their original green color to more yellowed. I won't give you the times for these phases simply because they vary wildly depending on the method of roasting. The relationships are usually consistent, but the lengths are not even close. The more heat, the faster you'll go through the stages. Be warned again. Too much heat, though, can burn the outside or leave the insides raw. After the drying phase, the beans begin to puff up and take on more of a browner color. For me, this phase tends to last roughly as long as the drying phase, maybe just a bit more. You'll know when that phase is ending because you'll hit what's called first crack. Because of the chemistry going on inside and the buildup of gases trying to escape, the bean itself will make an audible pop as it cracks open to release the pressure. There'll always be a few early birds, but once the popping begins for several beans at once, this is called the chorus. I would never consider a batch finished until at least hitting first crack. After first crack, the internal bean begins to caramelize and begins a chemical transition into a more complex state. This part of the process is actually exothermic, meaning it produces its own heat. Well, not a crazy amount. Usually it's good to be aware of that you can control the amount of heat you're putting in. Now is a good time to knock it back a notch or increase the airflow to allow more heat to escape. After a little bit of time, there will be a second crack as the beans expand further. While first crack tends to be a louder and more pronounced pop, second crack is a bit more subtle. You should have no problem noticing it, but there is a definite difference in the sound between the two cracks. As second crack hits, you're now entering the final phase. Just before the second crack to a bit after is usually where you want to end your roast. The sounding of the second crack signals the beans crossing the line into darker roasts. When you pull the heat, the beans will continue to roast a little bit while cooling. A lot like cooking a roast, depending on what you have for cooling, you might want to pull your batch just a bit early and let it coast into your desired finished result. All commercial roasters and most prosumer home models will use active cooling, meaning a fan will circulate air around the beans to accelerate the cooling. I've put a fan towards a colander and mixed the beans by hand for the first couple minutes to help stop the roasting process faster as the beans cool. Where you stop your roast is entirely a matter of tastes. Darker roasts have a lower caffeine content compared to lighter roasts. This may seem counterintuitive, but think of it as cooking the caffeine out of the beans. Darker roasts do, however, dissolve more easily into water, so you will get more of the coffee flavor. So now you've roasted your beans and are anxious to try the best cup of coffee you've ever made from scratch. Are you ready to drink it? Not yet. As the beans roast, they produce a large amount of carbon dioxide inside. You'll want to leave them for a bit to let this gas escape before brewing. The coffee won't have as much flavor, and you'll notice it doesn't even smell like coffee yet. As a personal suggestion, try to wait a minimum of 24 hours. I think I've heard 5 days is optimal. For anyone who's made a pour-over brew, the first step is usually to start with adding some water, then waiting for a bit while the grounds appear to foam up and settle back down. This is the gas escaping from the bean and is called the bloom phase. Again, if you do choose to make up your own rules and drink it right away, it won't hurt you or make you sick. It simply gives results that aren't as good as they could be. The final piece of advice I can offer is to keep trying and learning. As your roasting journey progresses, should you choose to take it, you'll get just a bit better batch after batch. One of the things I heard when learning is do 100 batches before you even start to get critical with yourself. You'll get more of a feeling for things like heat and time as you practice. That's why I recommend starting off with the same beans for as many batches as you can. This lets your technique be the variable in the experiment instead of trying to fight with a new set of parameters every time you go for it. It probably goes without saying, though, that if you can't absolutely stand what winds up in the cup, trying different beans can lead you closer to your preferred outcome. Ultimately, the judgment of success comes down to how much you like the finished cup. If it's good, it's good. That's all that matters. Another thing I'd say from experience is that you probably shouldn't go and shell out a ton of money for a fancy roaster thinking it will make you an instant hero. Like I said earlier, my primary roaster can be completely automatic, but I still make tweaks to accommodate variations. Even the humidity and temperature of the day you're working on can make a noticeable change. Something else to mention is the smoke that's produced during roasting. It is noticeable. While I can get away with it in my apartment, I still have to disable my smoke detectors while roasting. Keeping your machinery as clean as possible will also help. Coffee release is a type of oil that can build up and add to the smog factor. My machine recommends a full cleaning every 5 batches, and I find that to be a pretty reasonable amount. If I push it further, or say run off a batch or 2 of Robusta, it quickly becomes a stinky, smelly process. The garage is probably one of the best places to work. Outdoors can suffer from greater temperature extremes as well as wind that will alter your profile noticeably. Wherever you work, though, please keep an eye on it. Roasting isn't just a set it and forget it procedure. The coffee beans will release small pieces of the bean husk called chaff while roasting, and this chaff can be easy to start on fire in the wrong circumstances. I wouldn't be afraid of roasting by any stretch. Even when I started my roaster on fire, calm, swift action was enough to keep things under control. Remove heat, remove as much airflow as possible, and get the beans wet with plain water. It's easy enough to do if you catch it before it's managed to start your entire car on fire. So that's about it for today's journey through the art and science of home coffee roasting. I found it to be very enjoyable and rewarding. It's also saved me a bunch of money, as green beans are usually half or less than the price of roasted coffee in the stores. Plus, you will get a higher quality of grounds, as there won't be Robusta mixed in as filler, unless you put it there on purpose. Thanks for taking this time to learn about one of my favorite hobbies. I hope you give it a try someday. Enjoy your day.